Who are these new guys? Find out on this episode of Talk Gnosis with part 1 of Meet the Host. Welcome to Talk Gnosis for September 25th, 2013. I'm Bishop Kenneth Canterbury, and with me tonight is my lovely co-host, as typical, Bishop Lainie Petersen. How are you this evening, Lainie?
I am wonderful, Bishop Ken. How are you?
Awesome. Because tonight we get to introduce the viewers to our host. Many of them are kind of not used to these new faces they're seeing in front of them, so we thought we'd be doing a kind of a two-part series. And tonight I get the pleasure of interviewing Bishop Petersen and kind of talking about your history and your career a little bit.
Sure.
So I guess one of the first things I want to ask, Lainie, I've known you now, God, for well over a decade, but why don't you help our viewers kind of understand, how did you get up on the spiritual path?
That's kind of interesting. Growing up, I was raised in a Lutheran home and a very, Protestant middle class sort of thing. But I always had an interest in things of the spirit. I was also interested in occultism a little bit. I was interested in divination and seances and witchcraft and that sort of thing. But when I became a teenager, I decided to rebel by becoming a fundamentalist Christian, or pretty serious evangelical Christian with Pentecostal leanings and
Wow.
a very high view of the authority of Scripture. So that's where I was, and I managed to be thoroughly obnoxious for most of my teen years, and eventually decided that I was going to go into the ministry and headed off for college. Got my degree in philosophy and women's studies, and this time I had kind of mellowed a little bit. So I went to a mainline Protestant seminary right outside Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, I kind of developed, kind of went back to my interest in more esoteric spirituality. And I got involved with Chicago's esoteric community, which, as you know, is varied and wild and kind of crazy. But I was one of the organizers of Nutmeg, which was a annual gathering of people with esoteric interests who were also online. And you have to keep in mind, this was back in 1994 when many people were not yet online. So
Right.
we were kind of a special interest group. And I became an organizer kind of by accident with that. And eventually I ended up deciding to, instead of becoming ordained as a Baptist minister, I looked into the Episcopalians, I looked into the United Church of Christ. I was wanting for something a little bit more liturgical, but I ended up deciding on getting ordained in the Independent Sacramental Movement, which is kind of a broad community of churches that have apostolic succession, that practice the traditional sacraments, but that are not connected with the Anglican Church or with Rome or with the Eastern Orthodox churches. And I became involved with them
Mm-hmm.
and was ordained as a priest.
Now, let me interrupt you here for a second, and
Sure.
let's take kind of a step backwards a little bit, only because there was something that you kind of mentioned, which kind of touched bases with kind of my own history, which we'll talk about next week. Um, But you went through kind of the teenage years in this evangelical Pentecostal movement. It was during your college years that you started feeling a draw to those things kind of esoteric again. Was there any specific event, either that triggered it, either from the tradition you were in, within the Pentecostal movement? Was there something that made you go, huh, there's got to be more? I need to kind of explore more. Was it because you had entered into a college, started expanding your friends,
Mhm.
and came in contact with others that made you decide, there's something more than what I've been taught here? For most people, I find there's some form of trigger. Was there a trigger that really kind of led you on that kind of exploration, at least?
I think that there was part of it was is as a pro-abortion rights feminist, I really didn't fit very well in evangelical and Pentecostal churches, and so that was an issue because I was politically active in the areas of reproductive rights and feminism, and that really put me at odds with any of the evangelical churches in the area. So that kind of pushed me more into the mainline churches. But I think the evangelicalism also in Pentecostalism gave me a notion or a taste for real contact with spirit, not just not that there's anything wrong with mainline churches,
Mhm.
but many of them tend to be very suspicious of anybody who claims to have a real profound connection with the divine.
Right.
And so in the esoteric churches, I was able to find at least freedom, or at least tolerance for my political beliefs, but also a very strong support for somebody for wanting to have a mystical faith, and one that I could kind of touch beyond the letter of the scriptures and finding deeper meaning.
Hmm. Interesting. Now, you mentioned a little bit about starting going into a theological seminary. If anyone wants to look at your impressive of education, it's pretty impressive. We had, I know, the chance of working together about a decade. I'm trying to think. It's been about a decade ago, and I remember even then I was very kind of impressed by your resume. Um, and you've kind of, I mean, you've gone to theology, you've studied library sciences. How do you see all of these things kind of tying together for you?
Well, the interesting thing is my intention was to go to seminary, get my MDiv, which is the basic professional degree for ordained clergy,
Right.
eventually get a second master's degree, which would be an academic degree, and then get a PhD, probably in church history.
Hmm.
And that was my goal, and I worked on that until I came to the realization, for a number of reasons, that getting a PhD in church history may not be the best use of my time. For one thing, there aren't a lot of jobs available in that area, and so that was a genuine concern. So I thought, well, maybe I'll get a library degree. I could go work in a theological library, and that might be a safer bet because this library degree could lead to other kinds of work, and indeed it did. I mean, I ended up working in educational compliance for many years, and I'm now a freelance writer and researcher. So having that degree has been awesome.
Hmm.
The one thing, though, that sticks out is that I still have all this theological education, and that has helped a lot, even within this non-traditional movement that we're a part of.
Hmm.
Having some real grounding in theology and Bible and pastoral care and counseling and ethics has been wonderful. I'm not suggesting, however, that all esoteric or Gnostic clergy go out and go to seminary. For one thing, it's expensive, and you have to, most of our churches are the clergy don't get paid, so you're going to have to do a real cost benefit analysis before going that route.
Sure. Sure. One of the things, if I can kind of interject here, is that, within our own history, as I mentioned, we worked together for a while, about a decade ago,
Mhm.
and there were I would say, a few moments of my own history that were moments that I guess really moved me as a bishop and as a member of Gnostic clergy, and I can probably name those in one hand. Um, it was the baptism of both my daughter and my ex-wife, who I think you were present at that time. Um,
I was.
the consecration of Gerald DeCampo. If you remember that, I was moved
Mhm.
to tears. It was a very emotional time for me. And also making you as an archpriest and apostolic prefect. Um, Even though at that time I think we had only worked probably together for less than maybe a year or right around a year at that time.
Yeah.
But we also then had, for me, it was a very kind of large move because one of the things that's always, I think, been missing within our tradition, you hear all these great names in Gnostic history of all of our past patriarchs and everyone else, but you don't see a lot of women involved in the movement. And so for
Yeah.
me, kind of elevating one of our sisters into the office of an archpriest was a very high point of my career because at that point there were not a lot of women on the clergy.
Mhm.
And it was we felt so confident in you. If you remember, we made you a director of our formations program.
Yeah.
A lot of that because of your history. Now, there has not been a lot of women in Gnostic clergy, or even really kind of in the independent sacramental movements. Is there anything that you kind of attribute to that, and what have been some of kind of the obstacles you've had to overcome?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the issues in specifically in the Gnostic and esoteric lineages is that these churches have often served members of esoteric or various lodges,
Hmm.
Masonic and Martinist and whatnot lodges, and some of those lodges are closed to women. So that in and of itself may just keep women out of these churches because they don't see the need for it. If you don't belong to a lodge that's going to get you excommunicated from the Catholic Church, why bother?
Right,
I think that in some cases there is a problem when you have a boys' club, and I'm not blaming men in particular for that, but when you've got a bunch of men who've started the whole thing, it can be difficult for the men to work on making it more inclusive and open to women. And
right,
women may feel like there's no mentors for them there, or they may feel like the male clergy are uninterested in them or too interested in them, if
right.
that makes any sense. I think there's
Absolutely.
another issue that needs to be considered, and this is something that is true of a lot of independent groups, is that a lot of these groups are not family friendly. So
Right.
you might have women who are married, they may have children, they may be the primary caretakers for children, but if there's nothing for their kids in these parishes,
Hmm.
that may have no appeal for them. And a lot of the Gnostic churches get their clergy from people who join or who are interested. So without a family friendly model, that may also present a real issue.
Right. And as you well remember, my daughter at a young age would go to mass, and I would say that as far as family friendly, well, I guess I didn't consider it any more family friendly than her going to a Roman Catholic mass. But it's one of the things: your dad's a bishop, you're going to go to mass, child.
Yes.
And but I definitely understand it. I think that you know, it's one of the things maybe we have to kind of learn how to nurture is a little bit
Hmm.
more family friendly environment. And you also brought up a very good point of kind of having women as parts of our clergy, especially at things at its inception. Um, as you're well aware, there's a project that I'm not at liberty to discuss right now, but I've invited you to become part of this project. And part of the reason for that was the exact same reasons that you've mentioned, to make sure that we have kind of a female perspective kind of on the work that's at hand. And sometimes, maybe, for us to kind of take a step back and say, okay, how is this all going to work? And how does this kind of all fit in together where it's not coming from a male perspective? Now,
Yeah.
some of the traditions you've mentioned, um, in this country, the Masonic movement not open to women. Been a lot in Europe, for an example, especially in France, where the Gnostic tradition really kind of stemmed from. There are female lodges within Martinism, which for many years was tied like this with the French Gnostic Church, and to a certain degree still is. I know I'm a Martinist. Almost every Gnostic bishop I know is a Martinist. I know you're involved in Martinism. Um, and they have always been very friendly to both men and women as initiates. Um, do you think there will be a time within our tradition, as far as you know it, that you really will see women in equal kind of billing with men within this tradition?
I think it's going to be up to the women to take that role for themselves. And if women are going to have to, if that's what a woman wants to see within her own ecclesia, she's going to have to work on it. And I do think that she needs to make her concerns known to her fellow clergy if they're, if she's not a bishop, to her bishop, and to offer some constructive suggestions. It may need to be, at least initially, that there is somebody who takes over the role of a director for women's concerns, for example. In fact, there's been some research that has shown that women in traditional churches will have the women's power within the church often corresponds to the size of an autonomous women's auxiliary or organization.
Hmm.
And so I think that it may sound counterintuitive for the women to have somebody that they can specifically go to for mentoring, and perhaps even a women's organization that is separate within an ecclesia might actually help women to find their voice and step forward and move upward and throughout these churches. At the same time, we don't want a situation where women are being recruited or ordained or heaven help us, consecrated just to get women in, and you
Right.
end up with a poorly formed clergy person. That's the last thing we need. The movement has way too many
Right.
of those already.
I do know that within a tradition that I was part of for many years, is that one of the things that we did have was kind of a male formation program, and we had kind of a female formation program, and that one of our archpriests, was kind of in charge of, and I thought it worked very, very well because, there was that. Um, One of the things I want to touch on before we have to end the show is that everyone, I guess, has a different view of Gnosis, and I think when you're kind of bringing that female, I guess, perception into it, you know, um, one of the bishops I think of quite frequently, and one of my favorites within our movement, is a female bishop, Rosamond Miller, and she kind of describes herself as a wild Gnostic. And for any of those who are kind of familiar with her writings, I mean, she does not put any of the limitations with the Gnosis, which so many of these traditions have. Um, in a few minutes, how could you describe, your Gnostic experience? What does it mean to you to be Gnostic?
To me, it's a matter of developing insight, first of all, into myself, my motivations, subconscious and conscious, constant working on myself, but also being willing to admit what I don't know,
Hmm.
and to kind of strip myself of false knowledge, the assumptions that I make about myself and about other people. And I found that this requires a lot of conscious effort. So for me, it's a path very much of conscious effort.
Very, very good. You know, I bet if I would get 100 members of clergy on the room, I'm probably going to get 100 different definitions of what is Gnostic. And one thing, why I want to kind of impart to our viewers is that neither myself and I know neither do you kind of want to tell our viewers what Gnostic is. It is something that they have to kind of define from within themselves. There is no teacher, there's no mentor, there's no one out there who's going to impart Gnosis. Gnosis has to come from within. We can kind of recommend study this, study that. You can walk the path I did. Well, this is what worked for me. That's what worked for you. But again, every individual is going to be kind of different on how they sort of receive Gnosis.
True.
You know what? This is, I really thought maybe one episode was going to be enough to kind of get our history. I don't think one's going to be enough, but next week on part two, you're going to be interviewing me,
I am.
and and our viewership will get a little bit of my history. I
Mhm.
think that if our viewers have any questions, they can make sure that they put in any notes or comments on our YouTube channel. And if there's things that we see that they have questions of, I think we'll probably have to kind of retouch this at a future point. But it's been a pleasure kind of discussing your history. I hope that our viewers have got at least a little bit of an insight who the Bishop Petersen is. I want to thank you very much, as usual. I want to thank our great producer, Father Tony Sylvia, who is probably the best producer on YouTube. So thank you very much
Absolutely.
for all of your effort. I also want to mention that Gnostic NYC, for our viewers in New York, does have an open house this weekend. Make sure that you go to the to the Gnostic NYC Facebook page, as well as the Facebook Talk Gnosis page for more details and on the show. Again, please join us next week, where we'll be talking to me a little bit about my history. And Lainie, if you want to carry us out of the show this evening.
Absolutely. We do want to hear from our viewers, so please contact us through our YouTube channel on the comment section. Send us email or on our social media pages. You can find us at gnosticnyc.com and our Talk Gnosis Facebook page. And also want to remind everybody that this has been a production of the Gnostic NYC Network. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends, click the like button, and subscribe to our channel. The opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the views of Gnostic NYC or any organization. No animals were harmed during the production of this show, and no GMOs were used. For more Talk Gnosis, tune in every Wednesday for a new episode. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.